They're gonna kill me! Help!
Drop the phone, now! Hands where I can see them!
I didn't do anything, please!
Last warning, drop...
No, don't shoot! Help! They're gonna kill me!
Drop the phone! Get on the ground! Do it now! Hands up!
I didn't do anything, please!
Last chance! Drop him! Help me!
Jamal Whitaker believed the world still saw him as just another black teenager who didn't belong in certain neighborhoods. But when two officers decided to teach him a lesson, they had no idea they had just assaulted the only son of the state attorney general. The rhythmic bounce of the basketball against the pavement matched Jamal Whitaker's heartbeat as he made his way home from evening practice. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the suburban streets, painting the world in hues of amber and gold. At 17, Jamal carried himself with the grace of an athlete and the focus of a scholar, his 6'2" frame moving with purpose as droplets of sweat still clung to his dark skin despite the quick shower he had taken after Coach Williams finally called it a day. Jamal adjusted his headphones, letting the smooth beats wash over him as he replayed the practice in his mind. Coach had been particularly impressed with his three-point shooting, suggesting he might start in the upcoming game. The thought brought a small smile to his face. Starting as a junior would look good on college applications. Another achievement to add, alongside his near-perfect GPA and volunteer work at the community center. Rolling his shoulders to ease the pleasant ache of a good workout, Jamal shifted his gym bag to his other shoulder and checked the time on his phone. He had promised his father he would be home for dinner, which gave him just enough time for the short walk. His father, always punctual, valued timeliness almost as much as he valued integrity, a trait that had served Reginald Whitaker well in his career as the state's attorney general. Jamal had grown up watching his father build a reputation for fairness and accountability, lessons that had shaped his own approach to life. As he turned onto Maple Street, crossing from the more commercial area surrounding the high school into the residential neighborhood where sprawling homes set back from tree-lined streets, Jamal noticed a gradual change in his surroundings. The transition was subtle: larger yards, fewer pedestrians, more luxury vehicles and driveways. But Jamal had walked this route countless times over the years and barely registered the shift anymore. This was his community too, even if some people still gave him curious glances when he jogged through on weekends. The flash of red and blue lights reflected off a nearby car window caught Jamal's attention, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced over his shoulder to see a police cruiser moving slowly along the street about half a block behind him. Something in his chest tightened instinctively. A learned response formed from 17 years of cautionary talks with his father. Reginald had always been clear. Be respectful, keep your hands visible, don't make sudden movements, and always, always stay calm. Jamal lowered the volume on his headphones, but did not remove them, continuing his steady pace while keeping the cruiser in his peripheral vision. The vehicle edged closer, moving at a crawl that matched his walking speed. He considered calling his father, but decided against it. There was no reason to worry him over what was probably nothing. The cruiser pulled alongside him, and Jamal felt his heart rate quicken, despite his attempts to remain composed. He made brief eye contact with the officer in the passenger seat, a middle-aged white man with close-cropped hair and sunglasses despite the fading daylight. The officer stared back, expressionless, before saying something to his partner. Jamal looked ahead again, maintaining his pace, but suddenly acutely aware of every movement his body made. When the cruiser pulled slightly ahead and then angled toward the curb, blocking his path, Jamal knew his walk home had just become complicated. He stopped, removed his headphones, and let them rest around his neck, remembering his father's words, hands where they can see them. Two officers emerged from the vehicle, moving with the practiced coordination of longtime partners. The driver, a heavier-set man with a reddish complexion, approached with one hand resting casually on his holster. His nameplate read Harlan. The other officer, the one who had been watching Jamal, circled slightly wider, positioning himself to Jamal's left. His nameplate identified him as Vickers. "Afternoon," Officer Harlan said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp and assessing. "Mind if we ask what you're doing in this neighborhood?" Jamal felt a familiar weight settle in his stomach, the burden of having to justify his presence in spaces where some believed he didn't belong. He kept his expression neutral, his voice steady and respectful when he replied, "Just walking home from basketball practice, sir. I live a few blocks from here." Officer Vickers moved closer, his gaze sweeping over Jamal's athletic build, taking in the gym bag, the headphones, the smartphone in his hand. "You got some ID on you?" Jamal shook his head slightly. "No, sir. I just came from practice and didn't bring my wallet. My house is just up on Oakwood Drive, about 3 blocks from here." The officers exchanged a glance that made Jamal's skin prickle with unease. He had seen that look before: skepticism, suspicion, disbelief, though rarely directed at him so openly. This wasn't the first time he had been stopped, but something in the officer's demeanor told him this encounter was different. "No ID, huh?" Officer Harlan's voice hardened slightly. "That's convenient. And you expect us to believe you live in Oakwood Estates? Those are million-dollar homes, son." Jamal felt his throat tighten, but kept his voice even. "Yes, sir, my father and I have lived there for about 6 years now. Number 347, the blue colonial with white trim." Officer Vickers moved a step closer, invading Jamal's personal space in a way that was clearly intentional. "What's your name?" "Jamal Whitaker, sir." "And what's your father do that he can afford a place in Oakwood Estates, Jamal?" The emphasis on his name carried a note of disbelief that made Jamal's chest tighten further. "He works for the state government," Jamal answered, deliberately keeping his response vague. Experience had taught him that sometimes revealing his father's position created more problems than it solved, especially in situations like this, where tension was already building. Officer Harlan snorted. "State government, huh? Custodian? Maintenance?" His tone made it clear what he thought of Jamal's answer. The sun had nearly set now, the golden light replaced by the harsh artificial glow of street lamps just beginning to flicker on. A car drove past, slowing slightly as the driver noticed the police cruiser and the confrontation unfolding on the sidewalk. Jamal felt exposed, aware that to passing eyes he might look like just another young black man in trouble with the law rather than a student trying to get home for dinner. As the silence stretched between them, Jamal could feel the situation balancing on a knife's edge. He knew whatever happened next would depend largely on decisions beyond his control, a reality his father had prepared him for but could never fully shield him from. He stood perfectly still, hands visible at his sides, waiting for what would come next, with the careful composure that had become second nature in a world where his every movement was subject to scrutiny and misinterpretation. Officer Harlan circled Jamal slowly, his boots scraping against the concrete with deliberate heaviness, while Officer Vickers maintained his position uncomfortably close to Jamal's face. The fading daylight cast harsh shadows across their features, transforming what should have been a routine interaction into something that felt increasingly predatory. Jamal fought to control his breathing, keeping his hands clearly visible at his sides, as his father had always instructed him to do. "You know what I think?" Officer Harlan said, coming to a stop directly behind Jamal. "I think we've got ourselves someone casing these houses, maybe looking for an open window or an empty home to break into." Jamal felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but kept his voice steady. "No, sir, that's not what's happening. I really do live in this neighborhood. If you'd like to escort me home, my father can verify everything." Officer Vickers scoffed, his breath hot against Jamal's face. "Listen to that. Escort me home like we're some kind of chauffeur service." He reached out suddenly, grabbing Jamal's gym bag and yanking it from his shoulder. "What have you got in here, huh? Anything we should know about?" "Just my basketball uniform and some school books," Jamal replied, fighting every instinct that told him to reach for his property as Officer Vickers unzipped the bag and roughly dug through its contents. The officer pulled out a calculus textbook, waving it mockingly. Well, well, a real scholar here, Harlan." He tossed the book carelessly back into the bag before continuing his search, dumping Jamal's neatly folded uniform onto the sidewalk. "Please be careful with my things," Jamal said, his voice quieter now, the strain of maintaining his composure evident despite his efforts. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Oh, it's all..." Officer Harlan moved back into Jamal's field of vision, his expression hardening. "You want to talk about doing something wrong? How about trespassing? How about lying to officers? How about that attitude you're giving us right now?" "I'm not giving any attitude, sir," Jamal replied, his gaze locked straight ahead rather than meeting the officer's eyes. Another lesson from his father's careful instructions about surviving encounters like this. "And I'm not trespassing. I live here." Officer Vickers had finished rifling through the gym bag, finding nothing of interest, and turned his attention to Jamal's pockets. "Empty them," he commanded, gesturing impatiently. Jamal slowly reached into his sweatpants pockets, producing only his phone, house key, and some loose change. Officer Vickers snatched the phone from his hand, examining the locked screen. A photo of Jamal with his father at a law school fundraiser. "Fancy phone for a kid," Vickers remarked, turning it over in his hand. "Where'd you get this? Who'd you take it from?" "It's my phone," Jamal said, a note of frustration finally creeping into his voice despite his best efforts. "My father got it for me for my birthday last year." Harlan moved closer, crowding Jamal from the other side. "Your father who works for the state government, right? The one who bought that $1 million house on Oakwood. You expect us to believe that?" A car slowed as it passed, the driver watching the scene with visible concern. For a moment, Jamal felt a surge of hope that someone might stop, might witness what was happening. But the vehicle continued on after a warning glare from Officer Harlan. "Look," Jamal said, trying a different approach. "You can call my father if you want to verify. His number is in my phone, or we can walk to my house. It's really just a few blocks from here." Officer Vickers' hand suddenly shot out, gripping Jamal's upper arm with bruising force. "You trying to tell us how to do our job now? Sounds like you need to learn some respect." Jamal winced at the painful grip, but remained still, remembering his father's most urgent warning. "Don't resist, even when they're wrong, even when it's unfair. I respect your authority, sir. I'm just trying to explain the situation." "The situation," Officer Harlan said, stepping even closer, "is that we've got a suspicious individual with no ID in a high-value neighborhood where he doesn't belong, giving us lip and telling us how to do our jobs." He nodded to Vickers. "I think we need to continue this conversation down at the station." Officer Vickers' grip tightened further as he began to turn Jamal toward the police cruiser. "Let's go, smart guy. Maybe a trip downtown will refresh your memory about where you really live." "Please," Jamal said, his voice still controlled but tinged with genuine alarm. "Just call my father. He's expecting me home for dinner. He'll be worried." "Oh, Daddy's going to be worried," Vickers mocked, shoving Jamal forward. "Should have thought about that before you decided to go wandering where you don't belong." Jamal stumbled slightly under the force of the shove, but caught himself, careful not to make any movement that could be interpreted as resistance. "My father is Reginald Whittaker," he said, finally deciding that revealing his father's identity might be his only option. "He's the state attorney general." Both officers froze momentarily before exchanging glances. Officer Harlan's expression darkened and his voice dropped dangerously. "You think that's funny? You think making up lies about who your daddy is will help you right now?" "I'm not lying," Jamal insisted, a cold dread spreading through him as he realized that the truth was only making his situation worse. "My father is Reginald Whittaker, the Attorney General. You can verify that if you—" The rest of his sentence was cut off as Officer Harlan suddenly grabbed the front of his shirt, slamming him back against the cruiser with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. "That's enough of your smart mouth," he growled, his face inches from Jamal's. "One more word about being the Attorney General's son, and I'll add impersonating a public official to your charges." Jamal felt the cold metal of the car against his back, the officer's forearm now pressing against his chest, pinning him in place. The situation was spiraling beyond anything he had prepared for, beyond what his father's careful instructions had covered. He could feel panic trying to claw its way up his throat, but forced himself to breathe, to think. "Hands on the vehicle," Officer Vickers commanded, spinning Jamal around roughly and kicking his feet apart. "You know the drill." And Jamal did know, though he had never experienced it himself. The ritualized positioning of the body for a surge, the vulnerability of the stance, the power dynamic it enforced. He spread his fingers against the cool metal of the police cruiser as Officer Vickers began patting him down with unnecessary roughness, all while Officer Harlan stood watch, hand resting on his holster. Vickers' hands were anything but gentle as they moved roughly across Jamal's body. The pretense of a professional pat-down abandoned in favor of something that felt more like intimidation. Jamal kept his forehead pressed against the cool metal of the police cruiser, eyes closed, focusing on his breathing while trying to ignore the uncomfortable sensation of strange hands invading his personal space. "Nothing here," Vickers finally announced, sounding almost disappointed. "No weapon, no drugs." Harlan grunted in response. "Turn around," he ordered. Jamal complied slowly, careful to keep his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The officer's face was flushed with what seemed like a building anger, as though Jamal's lack of contraband was somehow a personal affront. "So you're still sticking with that story about living in Oakwood, about your daddy being the big-shot attorney general?" "It's the truth," Jamal replied, keeping his voice level despite the churning in his stomach. "My father is Reginald Whittaker. We live at 347 Oakwood Drive. You can verify." Harlan's hand shot out, shoving Jamal hard against the cruiser. "I told you to cut that crap. You think we're stupid? You think we don't know who the Attorney General is?" Jamal felt his back slam into the vehicle, the impact sending a jolt of pain up his spine. He swallowed hard, fighting to maintain his composure even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "I'm not lying. Please, just call the number in my phone or drive me home. It's less than 5 minutes from here." "You hear this kid, Vickers?" Harlan turned to his partner with an exaggerated expression of disbelief, still running his mouth about living in Oakwood like some baller or something. Vickers shook his head, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Yeah, and I'm the damn governor. Look, kid, drop the act, Harlan said. Tell us where you really live, where you really got that fancy phone from, and maybe we can work something out. I've told you the truth, Jamal insisted, feeling a rare flash of frustration breaking through his carefully maintained calm. This is my neighborhood. I'm just trying to get home. Harlan leaned in close, his breath hot against Jamal's face. You calling us liars, boy? You think we don't know who belongs in this neighborhood and who doesn't? The word boy hit Jamal like a physical blow, laden with centuries of history and degradation that he had been taught about since he was old enough to understand. He bit the inside of his cheek, forcing back the words that threatened to spill out. Nothing to say now, Vickers taunted, circling around to flank him from the other side. Cat got your tongue? Jamal took a deep breath. I'd like to call my father, he said, his voice quieter now but steady. I have the right to make a phone call. Harlan's laugh was harsh and without humor. You watch too much TV, kid. You're not under arrest yet, so you don't get a phone call. Right now, you're just a suspicious person being questioned. And so far, all you've done is lie to officers and give us attitude. I haven't lied about anything, Jamal responded, his patience beginning to fray despite his best efforts. He glanced at Harlan's badge number, trying to memorize it in the dim light. Officer Harlan, please, just... So now you're staring at my badge, Harlan cut him off, voice rising. You planning to make a complaint? Is that your game? No, sir, I just... Hands behind your back! Harlan barked suddenly, reaching for his handcuffs. You're being detained for further questioning. Jamal felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. On what charge? He asked, even as he began to comply, knowing resistance would only make things worse. Suspicious activity, possible trespassing, and now interfering with an officer, Vickers answered, grabbing Jamal's arm and roughly pulling it behind his back. Plus, you got a real attitude problem. Jamal winced as the handcuffs bit into his wrists, tightened with deliberate excess. This is bullshit, he muttered under his breath, immediately regretting the lapse as Vickers' grip tightened painfully on his arm. What was that? Vickers demanded, his voice dangerously soft. You got something to say? Jamal shook his head slightly. No, sir. Nah, I heard you, Vickers continued, spinning Jamal around to face him. You said this is bullshit, didn't you? You think you can disrespect officers doing their job. I didn't mean, The rest of his sentence was cut off as Vickers' fist connected with his cheekbone. The force of the blow snapped Jamal's head to the side and sent him staggering back against the cruiser. Pain exploded across the side of his face, his vision momentarily blurring as he fought to stay upright. You need to learn some respect, Vickers growled, advancing on him again. Jamal raised his cuffed hands instinctively, a reflexive gesture of self-protection that Vickers interpreted as resistance. He's resisting, Vickers shouted, lunging forward and grabbing Jamal by the throat. I'm not, Jamal choked out, but his protest was lost as Harlan joined the fray. Both officers now forcing him to the ground. Jamal felt his knees hit the pavement hard, then his shoulder as they pushed him down. Disoriented and in pain, he struggled to find a position that wouldn't leave him completely vulnerable, a movement the officers immediately seized upon. Stop resisting! Harlan yelled loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, creating a narrative that bore no relation to reality. His knee pressed into Jamal's back, driving the air from his lungs while Vickers held his head against the rough concrete of the sidewalk. I'm not resisting, Jamal gasped, barely able to draw breath. With Harlan's weight crushing him, he could feel warm wetness on his face, blood from where his cheek had been split open by Vickers' punch. Shut your mouth, Vickers hissed, pressing Jamal's face harder against the ground. You keep fighting and it's going to get a lot worse. The absurdity of the accusation that he, handcuffed and pinned by two grown men, was somehow fighting them, might have been laughable in any other context. But here, with his face bleeding and his chest compressed to the point where each breath was a struggle, Jamal understood with terrifying clarity how situations like this ended for young men who looked like him. The memory of his father's voice cut through his panic. Stay alive. Nothing else matters. Just stay alive and come home. So Jamal forced himself to go limp beneath the officer's brutal restraint, surrendering completely despite every instinct screaming at him to protect himself. That's better, Harlan said after a moment, his voice revealing a sick satisfaction that made Jamal's stomach turn. Now, maybe you're ready to tell us the truth about who you are and what you're doing here. My name is Jamal Whitaker, he repeated, his words slurred slightly from the swelling already beginning around his mouth. My father is Reginald Whitaker, the state attorney general. We live at 347 Oakwood Drive. Harlan grabbed a handful of Jamal's hair, yanking his head back painfully. You still sticking with that story? Even now? It's the truth, Jamal insisted, blinking blood from his eye, where it had trickled down from the gash on his cheek. Please just take me home or call my father. The officers exchanged glances over his prone form, something passing between them that Jamal couldn't read. Then Harlan nodded, and they hauled him roughly to his feet. "All right, tough guy," Vickers said, shoving Jamal toward the cruiser. "You want to play it this way? Fine, let's go downtown and sort this out." As they approached the vehicle, Jamal saw a woman walking her dog on the opposite side of the street, watching the scene with obvious concern. For a moment their eyes met and Jamal felt a flicker of hope. "Ma'am!" he called out, his voice strained but carrying clearly across the street. "Could you please call Reginald Whitaker at the Attorney General's office? Tell him Jamal is being—" A hard blow to his kidney cut him off, driving the air from his lungs and making his knees buckle. "Shut your mouth!" Harlan hissed, forcing Jamal's head down as he pushed him into the back seat of the cruiser. "Nobody's calling anybody." The door slammed shut with a finality that made Jamal's stomach drop. Through the window he could see the woman still standing there, uncertain, as the officer spoke to her briefly before returning to the vehicle. Whatever they had told her seemed to have worked. She was already continuing on her way, though she glanced back once with what looked like concern. Inside the cruiser, separated from the officers by a plastic partition, Jamal finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of his situation. His face throbbed where Vickers had struck him, blood still seeping from the cut on his cheekbone that would surely leave a visible bruise. His wrists burned from the too tight handcuffs, and his back ached where Harlan's knee had dug into it. The reality of what was happening settled over him like a physical weight as he gingerly touched his face, wincing at the tenderness of what was already swelling into a significant bruise. He thought of his father waiting at home, dinner getting cold, growing increasingly concerned as the minutes ticked by without any word from his son. Part of him wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all, but the pragmatic lessons his father had instilled in him kept him silent. This wasn't the place to fight back. As the engine started and the vehicle pulled away from the curb, Jamal closed his eyes and drew on the deep well of composure his father had helped him cultivate over years of carefully worded warnings and painfully honest conversations. "This isn't about fairness," his father had told him once. "It's about survival. You get through it, you come home, and then we fight back the right way." The cruiser accelerated down the quiet suburban street, taking Jamal further from his home with each passing moment. In the growing distance between where he was and where he should be, Jamal made himself a silent promise. He would survive this, and what these officers had done would not go unanswered. His father had taught him about justice as well as survival, and soon enough these officers would learn exactly what that meant. The ride to the police station passed in a blur of pain and mounting anxiety. As Jamal sat silently in the back of the cruiser, the taste of copper filling his mouth where his lip had split, he could hear Officers Harlan and Vickers laughing through the partition, their casual banter a jarring contrast to the violence they had just inflicted. His face throbbed where Vickers' fist had connected with his cheekbone, and he could feel the area swelling rapidly, his eye already beginning to narrow from the inflammation. "Bet he won't be running his mouth about being the AG's kid anymore," Harlan remarked loud enough for Jamal to hear. "These neighborhood kids think having money means they can talk to officers any way they want. Rich or not, they all bleed the same," Vickers replied with a chuckle that made Jamal's skin crawl. Though I got to say, for a basketball player, he went down pretty easy. The cruiser pulled into the station parking lot, the building's stark fluorescent lighting spilling onto the pavement as they parked. Harlan opened the rear door and yanked Jamal out by his arm with unnecessary force, causing him to stumble as his feet hit the ground. "Let's go, hotshot," Harlan growled, pushing him toward the entrance. "Time to process you properly." The station's interior was brightly lit and bustling with activity despite the hour. Officers at desks, detainees in holding areas, phones ringing. Several heads turned as the officers marched Jamal through the main area, his handcuffed wrists and bloodied face drawing curious glances. Jamal kept his eyes forward, trying to project dignity despite his appearance, acutely aware that every person they passed was forming judgments based solely on what they saw. A young black man in custody, obviously having resisted arrest. "Got a live one here, Sarge," Vickers called out as they approached the processing desk. Suspicious activity, trespassing, resisting arrest, and assaulting an officer. The desk sergeant, an older man with salt and pepper hair and deep lines etched around his mouth, looked up from his paperwork. His gaze moved from the officers to Jamal, lingering on the teenager's swollen face. "Assaulted an officer, did he?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "Which one of you?" "Both of us," Harlan replied smoothly, Kid went crazy when we questioned him about being in Oakwood Estates, started claiming he lives there, that his daddy's the Attorney General. When we tried to detain him, he took a swing at Vickers. The sergeant's eyebrows rose slightly as he took in Jamal's athletic but lean frame compared to the two burly officers. "That right?" he asked, his question directed at Jamal this time. Before Jamal could respond, Vickers' hand clamped down hard on his shoulder. "Don't waste your time, Sarge. Kid's been spinning tales all night." The sergeant held Jamal's gaze a moment longer, something unreadable in his expression, before returning his attention to the paperwork. "Name?" he asked, pen poised. "Jamal Whitaker," Jamal answered, his voice steady, despite the dull throb of pain radiating from his face. "I live at 347 Oakwood Drive. My father is Reginald Whitaker, the state attorney general. I was walking home from basketball practice when these officers—" Vickers' grip tightened painfully on his shoulder, still with the same story. Unbelievable. The sergeant frowned slightly. "Whitaker? Reginald Whitaker's son?" He looked at Jamal more carefully now, taking in his features despite the swelling and blood. "That's what he claims," Harlan said dismissively. "Been saying it since we picked him up. Kid's delusional." The sergeant held Harlan's gaze for a long moment before nodding slightly. "Process him then. Full booking procedure." Jamal felt his hope deflate as Harlan grabbed his arm again, steering him toward a side hallway. "This way, Junior," he said mockingly. "Time for your mugshot. Smile pretty for Daddy." They led him to a processing area where a bored-looking technician waited to take his photograph and fingerprints. The routine was impersonal and efficient. Stand against the wall, face forward, turn left, turn right, place fingers on the scanner, all while Jamal remained handcuffed and increasingly aware of how the system was designed to strip away dignity. "Beautiful," Vickers commented as the mugshot appeared on the technician's screen, showing Jamal's swollen face in harsh detail. "That's going to look great on your college applications." From the processing area, they moved to an interrogation room, a small windowless space with a metal table bolted to the floor and 3 uncomfortable-looking chairs. Harlan shoved Jamal roughly into one of the chairs before removing his handcuffs, only to immediately refasten one cuff to a metal loop on the table. "Wait here," he ordered unnecessarily. "We'll be back after we finish the paperwork." The door closed with a heavy thud, leaving Jamal alone in the sterile room. The overhead fluorescent light hummed incessantly, casting harsh shadows that accentuated the institutional bleakness. Jamal gingerly touched his face, wincing at the tenderness of his cheekbone. The skin had split where Vickers' knuckles had connected, leaving a laceration that had mostly stopped bleeding but would likely need stitches. He tried to organize his thoughts, to plan what he would say when the officers returned, but fatigue and pain made focus difficult. What had started as a routine walk home from practice had spiraled into a nightmare that seemed to be getting worse by the minute. He thought of his father, who would surely be worried by now. Dinner would have gone cold. Calls to his cell phone would be going unanswered. How long before his father started making calls, activating the resources at his disposal to find his missing son? The door opened abruptly, startling Jamal from his thoughts as Officers Harlan and Vickers re-entered, accompanied by a third man in plain clothes, a detective, based on the badge clipped to his belt. The detective's eyes immediately went to Jamal's face, his expression hardening slightly before smoothing into professional neutrality. "So," the detective began, taking the seat across from Jamal while the officers remained standing like sentinels on either side of the door. "I'm Detective Rivera. I understand we've had some trouble tonight." "Yes, sir," Jamal replied, straightening in his chair despite the discomfort. "These officers stopped me while I was walking home from basketball practice. When I explained who I was and that I live in the neighborhood, they accused me of lying, handcuffed me, and assaulted me." He gestured toward his face with his free hand. This was from Officer Vickers' fist, not from any resistance on my part. Harlan stepped forward, his face flushing. "That's not how it happened, Detective. This kid was acting suspicious in Oakwood Estates. When we questioned him, he became belligerent, then physically resistant when we attempted to detain him." "I didn't resist," Jamal countered firmly. "I was complying with all instructions. Officer Vickers struck me after I muttered something under my breath. Then they both tackled me to the ground while I was already handcuffed." Detective Rivera's gaze moved between Jamal and the officers, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Quite the different accounts," he observed neutrally. "What were you doing in Oakwood Estates?" "I live there," Jamal repeated, fighting to keep the frustration from his voice. 347 Oakwood Drive with my father, Reginald Whitaker." "The Attorney General," Rivera stated, neither a question nor an acceptance. "Yes, sir." Rivera turned to the officers. "Did you attempt to verify his address or identity?" "Kid had no ID," Vickers said quickly. Said his wallet was at home. Convenient, right? I was coming from basketball practice, Jamal explained, for what felt like the 100th time. I didn't take my wallet with me to the gym. And you didn't offer to just drive him to the address he gave to verify? Rivera asked the officers, his tone carefully professional. Harlan interjected. We had a suspicious individual in a high-value neighborhood who couldn't produce ID and became increasingly belligerent when questioned. Standard procedure is to bring them in for proper identification. Rivera nodded slowly, then returned his attention to Jamal. You're entitled to a phone call. Who would you like to contact? Before Jamal could answer, the door to the interrogation room swung open and the desk sergeant appeared, his expression unusually tense. Detective, he said, ignoring the officers. The young man's phone call has already been made. His father is here. A beat of silence followed the announcement, broken by Vickers' dismissive snort. Sure he is, and I'm the commissioner. The sergeant's face remained grave. State Attorney General Reginald Whitaker is in the lobby, demanding to see his son and the officers who arrested him. He's already called the chief. The color drained from Harlan's face as Rivera stood up abruptly. Uncuff him, the detective ordered, his voice taking on a new urgency. Now! Vickers hesitated, looking to Harlan, who seemed frozen in place. Detective, procedure requires... I said uncuff him, officer, now! Rivera's tone left no room for argument. As Vickers reluctantly moved to remove the handcuff from Jamal's wrist, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Purposeful, measured steps approaching with unstoppable momentum. Jamal recognized the rhythm immediately, a sound he had heard countless times coming up the stairs at home, down the hallway to his room, across the polished floors of his father's office. The door opened once more and Reginald Whitaker filled the frame, 6'4" of controlled fury in an impeccably tailored suit. Despite the late hour, his gaze swept the room, cataloging everything in seconds before settling on his son's battered face. For a brief moment, raw anguish flickered across his features before being replaced by the composed, implacable expression that had made him legendary in courtrooms across the state. Jamal, he said, his deep voice surprisingly gentle despite the steel beneath it. Are you all right? The simple question, laden with paternal concern rather than the thunderous rage Jamal knew was brewing beneath his father's professional exterior, nearly broke his carefully maintained composure. He swallowed hard before answering, I'll be okay, Dad. Reginald nodded once, his eyes never leaving his son's injured face, before turning to the officers who now stood ramrod straight, expressions vacillating between disbelief and dawning horror. When he spoke again, his voice was cold enough to crystallize the air in the small room. Which one of you put your hands on my son? The accusation hung in the air like a live wire as Reginald Whitaker's question reverberated through the small interrogation room. Neither Harlan nor Vickers seemed capable of speech, their earlier bravado evaporating under the Attorney General's withering gaze. Detective Rivera stepped forward, clearly attempting to regain control of a situation rapidly spinning beyond normal protocol. Mr. Attorney General, I'm Detective Rivera. I was just beginning to... Detective. Reginald cut him off smoothly, his voice deceptively calm. I appreciate your intervention, but my question was directed at these officers. His attention returned to Harlan and Vickers, who seemed to be silently negotiating which of them would speak. I'll ask once more. Which of you struck my son? Harlan found his voice first, professional training kicking in despite his obvious discomfort. Sir, I'm Officer Harlan. This is Officer Vickers. There was an altercation during the arrest when your son resisted. My son has a split cheekbone and what appears to be a black eye forming, Reginald interrupted, his words precise and measured. That didn't happen during an altercation. That happened when one of you struck him with enough force to cause significant injury. Now, before I review the body cam footage that I've already requested be preserved, I'm giving you the opportunity to tell me directly. The mention of body cam footage sent a visible ripple of tension through both officers. Vickers' jaw tightened, while Harlan's gaze darted briefly to his partner before returning to Reginald. The situation escalated quickly, Harlan offered weakly. Any force used was necessary to... Dad, Jamal interjected, his voice cutting through the tension. It was Officer Vickers who hit me in the face. Officer Harlan held me down afterward. Reginald nodded once, his eyes never leaving the officers even as he addressed his son. Thank you, Jamal. He turned to Detective Rivera. I want my son released into my custody immediately. I want him examined by a doctor and his injuries documented. And I want these officers' badges and firearms surrendered while a full investigation takes place. Rivera hesitated, caught between procedure and the unmistakable authority radiating from the state's top law enforcement official. Sir, there are protocols. "I'm aware of the protocols, Detective," Reginald replied evenly. "I helped write many of them. Right now, we have 2 officers who assaulted a minor, then filed false charges to cover their actions. This isn't a matter of protocol, it's a matter of law." A commotion in the hallway interrupted the standoff as more figures appeared in the doorway. The police chief, red-faced and disheveled as though he had dressed in haste, accompanied by a woman in a sharp pantsuit whom Jamal recognized as his father's chief of staff, Diane Chen. "Reginald?" the chief began, his tone conciliatory yet strained. "Let's move this discussion to my office." "After my son receives medical attention," Reginald countered, walking over to Jamal and gently helping him to his feet. "And after these officers are removed from duty," he turned to the desk sergeant who still hovered in the doorway. "Sergeant, please escort officers Harlan and Vickers to surrender their badges and firearms." The sergeant looked to the chief, who after a moment's hesitation nodded grimly. "Do it," he ordered, "and call internal affairs." As the officers were led away, both glaring daggers at Jamal, Reginald finally allowed himself to focus fully on his son, his eyes softening as he carefully examined the injury. "Let's get you to the hospital," he said quietly, placing a protective arm around Jamal's shoulders. The drive to the emergency room passed in relative silence. Reginald focused on navigating the late-night traffic while occasionally glancing at Jamal, who sat with his head resting against the window. Exhaustion finally catching up with him now that the immediate danger had passed. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the ordeal was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and pain that radiated from his face and the various places where the officers had manhandled him. "I'm sorry, Dad," Jamal finally said, breaking the silence as they approached the hospital. Reginald frowned briefly, taking his eyes off the road to look at his son. "What on earth are you apologizing for?" "For not calling earlier, for not finding a way to avoid this whole situation." Jamal gestured vaguely at his injured face. "You've always told me how to handle police encounters, and I still ended up—" "Jamal!" Reginald interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do. You survived. Everything else can be addressed." The emergency room was surprisingly quiet for a weeknight, allowing them to be processed quickly once the staff recognized the Attorney General. A middle-aged doctor with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor examined Jamal, cleaning the cut on his cheekbone and applying butterfly bandages after determining stitches weren't necessary. She documented each injury meticulously: the facial contusion, abrasions on his wrists from the handcuffs, bruising on his back and sides from being tackled and pinned to the ground. "You're lucky the orbital bone wasn't fractured," she noted as she finished her examination. "But you're going to have quite a shiner for a while. I'd recommend rest, ice for the swelling, and over-the-counter pain medication as needed." As the doctor completed her paperwork, Reginald stepped outside briefly to make a series of phone calls, his voice echoing faintly from the hallway as he mobilized the full weight of his office. When he returned, his expression was composed but determined. "The hospital administrator has agreed to expedite copies of your medical records," he informed Jamal. "The chief has already placed both officers on administrative leave pending investigation, and I've called Michael to meet us at home to discuss legal options." Michael Torres, the family's longtime friend and one of the state's most formidable civil rights attorneys. The mention of his name confirmed for Jamal that his father wasn't simply looking to smooth over the incident, but was preparing for a comprehensive response. The drive home was punctuated by more phone calls. Reginald's voice shifted between professional authority when speaking with law enforcement officials and paternal concern when updating his wife, who was waiting anxiously for their return. By the time they pulled into the driveway of their Oakwood Drive home, the very address the officers had refused to believe was Jamal's. It was late. Jamal's mother, Catherine, a federal judge whose usual composure matched her husband's, gasped audibly when she saw her son's face under the bright light of the entryway. "Oh, Jamal," she whispered, gently embracing him before her gaze hardened with the same controlled fury he had seen in his father's eyes at the police station. "They will answer for this," she stated. Not a threat, but a simple declaration of fact. Michael Torres arrived shortly thereafter, his normally jovial demeanor replaced by the focused intensity that had won him landmark cases against police departments across the state. As the adults gathered in the living room, Jamal found himself recounting the events of the evening for the third time, describing each detail with a clarity that surprised even him. The officer's initial approach, their dismissal of his explanation, the escalating hostility, and finally the violence. They didn't believe you lived here, Michael asked incredulously, shaking his head. Even when you gave them the exact address, they didn't want to believe him, Reginald corrected, his voice tight with controlled anger. This wasn't about verification, it was about power. They saw a young black man in an affluent neighborhood and made assumptions. When Jamal challenged those assumptions by insisting on his right to be there, they responded with force. Catherine, who had been taking notes throughout Jamal's account, looked up from her legal pad. What about witnesses? You mentioned a woman walking her dog. Jamal nodded. She saw part of it. She was across the street when they pushed me into the police car. I called out to her, asked her to contact Dad, but the officers cut me off. We'll find her, Michael assured them. Between the body cam footage, your medical records, and witness statements, we'll build an airtight case. As the discussion continued, Jamal felt a strange disconnection, as though he were observing the scene from outside his body. This was hardly the first time his parents had discussed legal strategy in this room. It was an occupational hazard of being raised by a top prosecutor and a federal judge, but it was the first time he had been at the center of such a discussion. The victim, the wronged party, the example. A memory surfaced. His father sitting him down at age 12 after a high-profile case, explaining with painful honesty the realities of being black in America. The world will not always see you as I do, Reginald had told him, his voice heavy with the weight of generations of similar conversations. They will not see your grades or your character or your potential. Some will see only your skin, and they will make judgments based on that alone. It isn't fair, it isn't right, but understanding this reality might one day save your life. 5 years later, that lesson had indeed potentially saved his life. The careful compliance, the controlled responses, the strategic decision about when to reveal his father's identity, Jamal had followed the playbook faithfully, yet still ended up bloodied and handcuffed in a police station. The injustice of it burned in his chest, even as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. Jamal needs rest, Catherine finally said, noticing her son's drooping eyelids. We can continue this tomorrow. Reginald nodded in agreement, placing a gentle hand on Jamal's shoulder. Go get some sleep, son. Your mother and I will handle things from here. As Jamal headed upstairs, moving carefully to avoid aggravating his various injuries, he could hear the conversation continuing below. His parents and Michael already shifting from documentation to strategy, from evidence collection to public response. They were mobilizing resources and connections built over decades in public service, preparing to transform his personal trauma into a catalyst for systemic change. Despite the pain and fatigue, a sense of purpose began to crystallize within him. What had happened that night was not merely a personal injustice, but a symptom of a deeper societal illness. And while Jamal had been taught to survive such encounters, he now understood that survival was just the beginning. What came after, the accountability, the reform, the refusal to accept such treatment as inevitable, that was where real change would happen. With that thought, he finally allowed himself to succumb to sleep, knowing that when morning came, the fight for justice would begin in earnest. As morning approached, the Whittaker home buzzed with activity despite the late hour. Reginald moved with methodical purpose through his home office, assembling documents, while Michael Torres catalogued Jamal's injuries with photographs. Catherine had transformed their dining room into a command center, arranging for statements to be taken and coordinating with her judicial colleagues about the handling of the case. Jamal sat at the kitchen counter, holding an ice pack to his face, while watching his parents orchestrate the response with a mixture of amazement and exhaustion. The family's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Alvarez, fussed over him, placing a mug of hot tea beside him despite the warm weather. You should be in bed, mijo, she said softly, her worried eyes examining his bruised face. Your parents will handle everything. I know they will, Jamal replied, managing a small smile despite his swollen cheek, but I need to be part of this. The doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of Diane Chen, Reginald's chief of staff, along with a grim-faced man Jamal recognized as the department's internal affairs director. Their hushed conversation with Reginald in the foyer carried tones of urgency and concern. The body cam footage has been secured, the internal affairs director was saying. Preliminary review confirms your son's account entirely. It's damning. Reginald nodded, unsurprised. I want formal charges prepared by noon. Assault on a minor, false imprisonment, filing false reports, civil rights violations, the complete list. No administrative leave with pay, no quiet resignation. These officers face the full consequences. The house phone rang and Catherine answered in the other room, her voice shifting from personal to professional in an instant. "Yes, Governor, we appreciate your concern. Yes, Jamal is recovering. Reginald is preparing a formal statement for this morning." Jamal hadn't fully processed how quickly his personal ordeal had transformed into a statewide incident until he heard his mother speaking with the governor. The machinery of justice, the very system his parents had dedicated their lives to upholding, was now mobilizing around him. Reginald returned to the kitchen, his expression softening slightly as he looked at his son. "The officers are being called in right now," he informed Jamal. "They don't know yet what's coming. I want you to rest, but if you're feeling up to it, your statement to Internal Affairs would be valuable this morning." Jamal straightened, removing the ice pack from his face. "I'm ready now," he stated with a conviction that seemed to surprise his father. "I want to tell them exactly what happened." 2 hours later, Jamal sat in his father's office at the Department of Justice. His statement recorded and signed while the building around them hummed with unusual activity for so early in the morning. Through the glass walls he could see staff moving with purpose, phones ringing continuously as news of the incident spread through official channels. "The press conference is scheduled for noon," Diane informed Reginald as she entered with a tablet displaying various news websites. "It's already breaking on social media. Someone at the hospital leaked a photo of Jamal in the ER." Reginald frowned, glancing at his son before reviewing the tablet. "Unavoidable, I suppose. At least it shows the injuries clearly." He passed the device to Jamal, who found himself looking at a hastily captured image of his own bruised face under the harsh hospital lights. The caption read, "A G's son allegedly beaten by police. Officers placed on administrative leave." Diane continued, "Harlan is already calling the union rep. Vickers still doesn't realize the seriousness. He actually showed up for his shift this morning." A knock at the door preceded the entrance of Captain Reynolds, the police chief's deputy, who had been tasked with handling the department's response. Her face was professionally composed, but Jamal could see tension in her shoulders as she addressed his father. "Attorney General, we've placed Officers Harlan and Vickers in separate conference rooms as requested. The chief is on his way in from home." Reginald nodded curtly. "Which room is Harlan in?" "Conference room A, sir. I've instructed both officers not to communicate with each other or anyone else about the incident until further notice." The elevator ride passed in intense silence, Jamal standing tall despite the persistent ache in his face and the stiffness in his shoulders. His father's contained fury was almost palpable in the confined space, a controlled storm that Jamal had witnessed only rarely in his lifetime. The doors opened onto an administrative floor, revealing a corridor lined with glass-walled conference rooms. Through one set of windows, Jamal could see Officer Harlan sitting alone at a table, nervously tapping his fingers. The man looked smaller somehow, stripped of the authority that had made him so intimidating the night before. When he glanced up and spotted Jamal standing beside his father, his face drained of color. "I'd like to speak with Officer Harlan first," Reginald stated, his voice deceptively calm. "Jamal, you can wait with Diane if you prefer." "No, I'm coming in," Jamal replied, squaring his shoulders. "I want him to see exactly what he did." As they entered the conference room, Harlan rose automatically, police training kicking in despite the circumstances. "Sir," he began, voice tight with poorly concealed anxiety, "I understand there's been a complaint about last night's arrest procedure." Reginald's laugh held no humor. "A complaint? Is that what you call this?" He gestured to Jamal's face, the bruising now fully developed into a spectacular array of purple and blue beneath the fluorescent lights. "My son was assaulted while handcuffed and compliant." "That goes well beyond a complaint, Officer Harlan." Harlan swallowed visibly, gaze darting between father and son. "Sir, with all due respect, the situation last night was complex. We had reports of suspicious activity in Oakwood Estates, and when we encountered your son, he was unable to produce identification." "Because I was coming from basketball practice," Jamal interjected, meeting Harlan's eyes steadily. "I told you exactly who I was and where I lived. You chose not to believe me." Michael Torres stepped forward, placing a folder on the table. "Officer Harlan, we've already reviewed the body cam footage. It clearly shows that at no point did Jamal resist arrest or act aggressively toward either you or Officer Vickers. It also clearly shows your partner striking Jamal without provocation while he was handcuffed." Harlan's professional facade cracked slightly. "Attorney General, I want to be clear that I didn't personally strike your son. That was Officer Vickers' action, not mine." "But you didn't stop him," Reginald observed coldly. "You then participated in tackling my handcuffed son to the ground, filing a false report claiming he resisted arrest, and processing charges you knew to be fraudulent." The officer's gaze dropped to the table. "I followed procedure for a suspect." "Who?" Reginald interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. A suspect? He's a 17-year-old boy walking home from basketball practice in his own neighborhood to his own house. The address he gave you repeatedly was correct. At what point did your procedure require assaulting a minor? Harlan had no answer, his earlier confidence evaporating under the Attorney General's withering scrutiny. Jamal watched the exchange with a strange detachment, as though observing a scene in which he was both central character and silent witness. The dynamic had shifted so completely. The officer who had towered over him with casual menace now reduced to stammering excuses under his father's questioning. "I want to know something," Jamal said suddenly, drawing both men's attention. "If I hadn't been the Attorney General's son, what would have happened to me?" The question hung in the air, its implications unavoidable. Harlan's gaze shifted uncomfortably before he answered with reluctant honesty. "You would have been processed for resisting arrest, possibly assault on an officer. With your clean record, probably probation, community service. For walking home," Jamal stated flatly. "For existing in my own neighborhood." Reginald placed a hand on his son's shoulder, the gesture both protective and proud. "Officer Harlan, you and Officer Vickers are being placed on administrative leave effective immediately pending criminal investigation. Your service weapons and badges will be surrendered before you leave the building today, as they should have been last night." "Criminal investigation?" Harlan echoed, alarm overtaking his expression. "Sir, surely this can be handled internally through standard—" "Through what, officer?" Reginald cut him off. "Through the same process that would have given my son a criminal record had he been anyone else's child? No. This will be handled through the proper legal channels with all the transparency that entails." Captain Reynolds, who had been observing silently from the doorway, stepped forward. "I'll escort Officer Harlan to surrender his badge and weapons." As Harlan was led from the room, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Jamal felt no satisfaction, only a growing determination that what had happened to him should lead to actual change. What troubled him most wasn't the personal injustice, painful as it was, but the casual certainty with which Harlan had acknowledged what would have happened to any other young man in his position. "Are you all right?" Reginald asked quietly when they were alone. Jamal nodded, wincing slightly at the movement. "Yeah, it's just strange seeing him like that after last night." "Power shifts quickly when accountability enters the equation," Reginald observed, studying his son's face with paternal concern. "Ready for round two?" "Definitely," Jamal replied, straightening his shoulders as they prepared to confront Officer Vickers. "Let's finish this." Officer Vickers sat alone in conference room B, drumming his fingers against the polished table with affected nonchalance that couldn't quite mask his growing unease. Unlike Harlan, whose anxiety had been evident from the moment they entered the station, Vickers maintained a posture of defiance. Chin raised, shoulders squared, jaw set in stubborn lines that suggested he still believed he had done nothing wrong. That confidence visibly faltered when Reginald Whittaker entered the room with Jamal at his side, the teenager's bruised face providing irrefutable evidence of Vickers' handiwork. "Officer Vickers," Reginald began without preamble, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him a formidable presence in courtrooms across the state. "I believe you and I have matters to discuss regarding your conduct last night." Vickers' gaze darted between Reginald and Jamal, recognition dawning alongside a flicker of alarm that he quickly suppressed. "Sir, I understand there's been a complaint, but I followed departmental procedure." "For what exactly?" Reginald interrupted, gesturing toward the chair opposite Vickers while remaining standing himself. "For assaulting a handcuffed minor? For filing a false report? For charging an innocent young man with crimes he didn't commit? Please enlighten me about which procedure covers those actions." Michael Torres placed a laptop on the table, opening it to reveal a freeze frame from the bodycam footage, the precise moment when Vickers' fist connected with Jamal's face. "We've reviewed the footage, Officer Vickers, all of it. There's no ambiguity about what happened." Vickers' facade cracked slightly as he stared at the damning image before quickly recovering. "That doesn't show the whole story. The suspect was resisting." "The suspect is my son," Reginald stated flatly, "and he was handcuffed and compliant when you struck him. The footage shows that clearly." "With respect, sir," Vickers countered, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "We had no way of knowing he was your son. He was in a high-value neighborhood without ID, giving us attitude." "Attitude?" Jamal echoed incredulously, unable to remain silent. "I told you exactly who I was and where I lived. I complied with every command. The only attitude was refusing to accept being treated like a criminal for walking home." Vickers' gaze hardened as he addressed Jamal directly for the first time. "You muttered something disrespectful under your breath. You tensed up when I was cuffing you." "I flinched because you were hurting me," Jamal replied evenly, meeting Vickers' glare without wavering. And even if I had said something disrespectful, that doesn't justify punching me while I was handcuffed. Reginald's hand came to rest supportively on Jamal's shoulder before he addressed Vickers again. Officer, the body cam footage shows you striking my son with enough force to nearly fracture his orbital bone. It shows you and Officer Harlan tackling him to the ground while he was already restrained. It shows you filing a report claiming he assaulted you when no such thing occurred. His voice remained measured, but the cold fury beneath it was unmistakable. These aren't matters of perception or interpretation. They're documented facts. Something in Vickers seemed to snap as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his defenses. Look, he said, leaning forward with an air of confidential urgency. Maybe things got a little out of hand last night, but this happens all the time. Kids giving us lip, claiming they live in neighborhoods where they don't belong. 99% of the time we're right to be suspicious. And that justifies assault in your mind? Reginald asked quietly. That makes it acceptable to inflict physical harm on a handcuffed teenager because you didn't believe where he lived? Vickers' expression hardened again. With all due respect, sir, you don't know what it's like out there. We make split-second decisions to protect these communities. Sometimes things get physical. That's the reality of police work. I'm very familiar with the realities of police work, Officer Vickers, Reginald replied, his tone cooling several degrees. Just as I'm familiar with your service record. 3 excessive force complaints in the past 2 years, all involving young black men, all dismissed during internal review. The color drained from Vickers' face. You've been looking into my record. I am the Attorney General, Reginald reminded him simply. And yes, I've reviewed both your record and Officer Harlan's. What I found suggests a pattern, not an isolated incident. Captain Reynolds, who had returned after escorting Harlan to surrender his badge and weapon, stepped forward from her position by the door. Officer Vickers, you are being placed on administrative leave effective immediately pending criminal investigation. You will surrender your badge and service weapon before leaving the building. Criminal investigation, Vickers repeated, his voice rising with indignation. For doing my job, this is what police work looks like. That's the reality of police work, Reginald observed coldly. Just as I'm familiar with your service record. 3 excessive force complaints in the past 2 years, all involving young black men, all dismissed during internal review. The color drained from Vickers' face. You've been looking into my record. I am the Attorney General, Reginald reminded him simply. And yes, I've reviewed both your record and Officer Harlan's. What I found suggests a pattern, not an isolated incident. Captain Reynolds stepped forward. Officer Vickers, you are being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately pending criminal investigation. You will surrender your badge and service weapon before leaving the building. Criminal investigation, Vickers repeated, his voice rising with indignation. For doing my job? This is what police work looks like. Reginald's expression hardened. No, Officer Vickers, this is what abuse of power looks like, and it ends today. Vickers' gaze shifted to Jamal, something ugly flickering in his expression. So the AG's kid gets special treatment. Must be nice having Daddy clean up your messes. Jamal stiffened at the accusation, but Reginald's response came first, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Let me be perfectly clear, Officer Vickers. This isn't about special treatment. This is about holding accountable an officer who abused his power and assaulted a minor. The fact that the minor happens to be my son means I have the resources and position to ensure that accountability happens swiftly and transparently. But make no mistake, this would be happening regardless. He leaned forward slightly, his imposing height combined with the authority of his office, creating a presence that seemed to fill the room. And if you believe for one moment that I wouldn't pursue the same justice for any other young man subjected to similar treatment, you fundamentally misunderstand both my office and my character. The silence that followed was broken only when Captain Reynolds stepped forward again. Officer Vickers, please come with me to surrender your badge and weapon. For a moment, it seemed Vickers might refuse. His jaw worked silently, hands curling into fists on the table's surface, but whatever defiance remained within him withered under Reginald Whittaker's unwavering gaze. He stood slowly, shoulders slumping in defeat, as the full weight of his situation finally registered. This isn't right, he muttered more to himself than anyone else as he followed Reynolds toward the door. This isn't how it's supposed to go. As Vickers passed, Jamal spoke up one final time, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his throat. Officer Vickers, I want you to know something. If I hadn't been the Attorney General's son, you would have gotten away with this, just like you did those other 3 times. That's what isn't right. Vickers offered no response beyond a darkening of his already thunderous expression as he was led from the room, leaving Jamal and Reginald alone with Michael Torres, who began gathering his materials from the table. That went about as expected, Michael observed grimly. Neither of them sees the fundamental problem with their actions. In their minds, the only mistake was choosing the wrong target. Reginald nodded, his professional demeanor softening slightly now that the confrontations were complete. "Jamal, how are you holding up? We can head home if you need to rest." "I'm okay," Jamal assured him, though fatigue was beginning to weigh heavily on his shoulders. "What happens next?" Reginald checked his watch before answering. "The chief should be arriving shortly. I want to review the next steps of the investigation with him personally. Then we need to prepare for the press conference at noon." "Press conference?" Jamal echoed, suddenly remembering that his father's position meant this incident wouldn't remain private for long. "Yes," Reginald confirmed, his expression softening further as he regarded his son. "This isn't just about what happened to you, Jamal. It's about ensuring it doesn't happen to others. That means making it public, making it matter." He paused, studying Jamal's bruised face. "But you don't have to participate if you don't want to. Your privacy?" "I want to be there," Jamal interrupted, with quiet determination. "People need to see what happened. They need to know." Reginald nodded, pride briefly overtaking the anger and concern that had dominated his expression since arriving at the station. "All right then, let's make sure they do." As they exited the conference room, the administrative floor had taken on the charged atmosphere of crisis management. Officers moved with heightened urgency, phones rang constantly, and whispered conversations halted abruptly as the Attorney General and his son passed. Through the glass walls of the chief's office, Jamal could see Captain Reynolds already briefing the newly arrived police chief, whose grave expression suggested he understood the severity of the situation. What had begun as a routine walk home from basketball practice had transformed overnight into something far larger, a potential inflection point in the ongoing struggle for accountability and justice. As Jamal followed his father toward the next confrontation, he felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his young shoulders alongside the lingering pain of his injuries. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the others who didn't have an attorney general for a father, who didn't have the power to make their voices heard. For them, Jamal would stand tall and let his bruised face tell the story that so many others had been unable to share. The press room at police headquarters was filled beyond capacity when they arrived. Reporters from local and national outlets packed shoulder to shoulder, cameras and microphones at the ready. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Reginald entered with Jamal at his side. The teenager's bruised face drew every eye in the room. Reginald stepped to the podium, the familiar posture of the state's chief law enforcement officer in full professional mode, while Jamal stood slightly to the side, back straight despite his fatigue. The flashbulbs created a strobe-like effect as photographers captured image after image of father and son, the Attorney General, and the living evidence of police brutality that could no longer be denied. "Last night," Reginald began, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room, "my 17-year-old son Jamal was walking home from basketball practice when he was stopped by officers Frank Vickers and Thomas Harlan of this department. Despite identifying himself accurately and complying with their instructions, he was handcuffed, physically assaulted, and falsely arrested on fabricated charges." Reginald gestured to Jamal, whose bruised face spoke more eloquently than words could about what had occurred. The incident was captured in its entirety on the officers' body cams, leaving no doubt about the facts. While my son was handcuffed and compliant, Officer Vickers struck him in the face with enough force to cause significant injury. Both officers then tackled him to the ground, filed false reports claiming he had resisted arrest, and processed fraudulent charges. The reporters scribbled frantically, cameras flashed continuously, and the tension in the room built as Reginald continued. "As Attorney General, I have directed my office to file criminal charges against both officers by the end of today. They have been placed on unpaid administrative leave and have surrendered their badges and service weapons. But this is just the beginning." Reginald's expression hardened as he leaned slightly into the microphone. What happened to Jamal is not an isolated incident. It is symptomatic of systemic issues within law enforcement that have been allowed to persist for far too long. Today I am announcing a comprehensive investigation into this department's policies, training, and handling of complaints. We will be holding public hearings where citizens can share similar experiences, and I am putting every department in this state on notice. There will be zero tolerance for misconduct, excessive force, or civil rights violations under my watch. The room erupted with shouted questions, cameras clicking frantically as reporters competed for attention. Reginald raised a hand for silence before continuing. Before taking questions, I want to give my son an opportunity to speak about his experience directly. He stepped back from the podium, placing a supportive hand on Jamal's shoulder. As the teenager moved forward, the room fell quiet again, the assembled press corps seemingly holding their collective breath as Jamal faced them. Despite his youth and the visible evidence of trauma on his face, he carried himself with remarkable composure as he looked out over the sea of eager journalists. "Last night," Jamal began, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I was walking home from basketball practice when 2 police officers stopped me. I told them who I was and where I lived. I complied with every instruction they gave me. I kept my hands visible. I didn't resist." He touched his bruised cheek gently. "This happened anyway." The simplicity of the statement hung in the air, powerful in its unadorned truth. Jamal continued after a brief pause. "I'm standing here today because my father is the Attorney General. That means I have resources and support that many others don't have. But what happened to me happens to people across this state and this country every day. The only difference is that most of them don't have someone with power to make others listen." His voice grew stronger, more certain with each word. "So I'm asking you to listen now, not just to my story, but to all the stories that haven't been told. Because the people who experienced them didn't have an Attorney General for a father. What happened to me was wrong. What happens to others like me is wrong, and it needs to stop." The room remained hushed for a moment as Jamal stepped back, the impact of his words settling over the assembled press. Then, like a dam breaking, questions erupted from every corner, reporters shouting over one another for attention. Reginald returned to the podium, fielding inquiries with practiced precision while Jamal stood beside him, his bruised face a silent testimony that no amount of official explanations or technical language could erase. Outside the press room, beyond the walls of the police station, the first broadcasts were already hitting the airwaves, Jamal's injured face appearing on screens across the state, his measured words carrying into homes and offices where the reality of police misconduct could no longer be dismissed as abstract statistics or isolated incidents. What had begun as one teenager's traumatic encounter was transforming in real time into a catalyst for change that would extend far beyond a single night or a single arrest. 1 week later, Jamal stood before the bathroom mirror, gently touching the fading bruise on his cheek. The angry purple had softened to yellows and greens around the edges, the swelling nearly gone, though the memory remained vivid in his mind. From the kitchen downstairs, he could hear the familiar sounds of his mother preparing breakfast, while his father's voice carried from the home office, engaged in yet another call related to the investigation that had consumed the Whittaker household since that night. The past 7 days had unfolded with dizzying speed. Officers Harlan and Vickers had been formally charged with assault, filing false reports, and civil rights violations. The announcement came just hours after the press conference, accompanied by their booking photos that now appeared alongside Jamal's bruised face in news coverage across the country. The police union had initially threatened legal action before retreating into damage control when public opinion turned decisively against the officers following the release of selected portions of the body cam footage. Chief Rollins had announced his early retirement 3 days later, positioning it as creating space for new leadership, though everyone recognized it as the political casualty it was. Captain Reynolds had been named interim chief with a mandate for reform that included implementing body cameras for all officers, revising use of force policies, and establishing an independent civilian review board. Jamal descended the stairs slowly, each step a conscious choice to move forward, despite the lingering physical and emotional aftermath of the encounter. In the kitchen, his mother looked up from the stove with a warm smile that couldn't quite mask the protective concern that had characterized her interactions with him since that night. "How are you feeling this morning?" Catherine asked, sliding a plate of pancakes onto the counter. "Better," Jamal replied, the answer more truthful than it had been in previous days. "The soreness is mostly gone." His father entered the kitchen, ending a call with a terse, "Keep me updated," before pocketing his phone and joining them. Reginald's expression brightened slightly as he regarded his son. "Ready for today?" Jamal nodded, though uncertainty flickered briefly across his features. Today marked his return to school after a week's absence, a return that would be complicated by his newfound visibility as both victim and symbol. His face had been on every news channel, his words quoted in newspapers and shared across social media. What had been a private trauma had become a public narrative that extended far beyond his control. "You don't have to do this interview tonight if you're not ready," Catherine reminded him, referring to the national news program that had requested an exclusive with the Whittaker family. "No one would blame you for wanting more time." Jamal shook his head slightly. The longer we wait, the easier it becomes for people to forget or move on. We need to keep the pressure on while people are still paying attention. Reginald studied his son with a mixture of pride and concern. You've taken on a lot for someone your age. It's okay to set boundaries, to take space for yourself in all of this. I know, Jamal acknowledged, the maturity in his voice belying his 17 years. But every time I think about stepping back, I remember what you always taught me, that having privilege means using it to help others. This is how I can do that right now. The drive to school passed mostly in silence, both father and son lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the campus, Jamal could see the news van parked across the street. Despite the school administration's efforts to keep media at bay, several students lingered near the entrance, their curious gazes following Reginald's car as it pulled into the drop-off zone. "I'll pick you up after practice," Reginald said as Jamal gathered his backpack. "Call me if you need anything before then." Jamal nodded, steeling himself for what awaited beyond the car door. "I will." The school hallways fell into hushed whispers as he made his way to his locker, the fading bruise on his face drawing every eye despite his classmates' attempts at subtlety. Some offered awkward smiles or brief words of support. Others seemed unsure how to approach him, as though his experience had created an invisible barrier between them. It wasn't until he reached the gymnasium for basketball practice after classes that Jamal felt something approaching normalcy return. Coach Williams gathered the team, addressing the elephant in the room with characteristic directness. "Jamal has been through something none of you should ever have to experience," he stated plainly. "He's here today because he's strong enough to move forward and because basketball is about team, about having each other's backs no matter what. So we're going to give him the space to be just another player on this court, and we're going to have his back like teammates should." The simple declaration seemed to break the tension, allowing the team to fall into their familiar rhythms as practice began. On the court, focusing on nothing but the ball and movement and the play developing around him, Jamal found a temporary refuge from the weight of everything else. For those 2 hours, he wasn't a symbol or a victim or a catalyst for change. He was just a basketball player, finding his way back to himself through the game he loved. After practice, he found his father waiting in the parking lot, as promised, accompanied by Michael Torres, whose presence suggested the legal machinery continued to advance at full speed. "How was it?" Reginald asked, as Jamal slid into the passenger seat. "Better than I expected," Jamal admitted. "Once we started playing, everything else faded into the background for a while." Michael smiled from the back seat. "That's good to hear. Finding those moments of normalcy is important." As they drove home, Michael updated them on the investigation's progress. Internal Affairs had uncovered 12 similar complaints against officers Harlan and Vickers over the past 3 years, all dismissed during internal review despite multiple witnesses and, in 2 cases, hospital records documenting injuries. The pattern established a damning picture of departmental negligence and potential complicity in covering up excessive force. The DEA is considering additional charges based on these findings, Michael explained, and we've been contacted by attorneys representing 3 other young men with nearly identical experiences. They're willing to testify at the hearings next month. Jamal listened silently, understanding that what had happened to him was expanding into something much larger, a potential watershed moment in the ongoing struggle for police accountability in their state. The weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on him, but alongside it grew a sense of purpose that helped balance the burden. At home, Catherine had prepared dinner while coordinating with the network producers for the evening's interview. The dining room had been rearranged to accommodate cameras and lighting, transforming their private space into a temporary studio. As the technical crew made final adjustments, the family gathered in the kitchen, a moment of quiet before stepping back into the public eye. "Remember," Reginald advised, his hand resting supportively on Jamal's shoulder, "you only share what you're comfortable sharing. If a question feels too personal or you need a break, just say so." Jamal nodded, drawing a deep breath to center himself. "I'm ready." The interview unfolded with professional smoothness, the veteran anchor guiding them through their account of that night and its aftermath. Jamal spoke with the same measured dignity he had displayed at the press conference, neither downplaying the trauma of his experience nor allowing it to define him entirely. "Many people have called you courageous for speaking out," the anchor observed toward the end of the segment. "How do you see your role in this unfolding conversation about police reform?" Jamal considered the question carefully before answering. I don't think of it as courage so much as responsibility. What happened to me happens to others who don't have the resources or platform I have. If speaking about my experience helps create change that prevents this from happening to someone else, then that's what I need to do. And you, Attorney General, the anchor continued, turning to Reginald, how do you balance your role as the state's chief law enforcement officer with being the father of a young man who experienced police brutality firsthand? Reginald's expression remained composed, though his eyes betrayed the emotion beneath. There's no contradiction between those roles. As Attorney General, my job is to uphold the law and ensure justice for all citizens. As a father, my job is to protect my son and teach him to stand up for what's right. In this situation, those responsibilities align perfectly. What happened to Jamal was wrong, both legally and morally. Addressing that wrong serves both justice and my son. After the cameras had been packed away and the crew had departed, the family settled in the living room, the familiar space reclaimed from its temporary conversion to a television studio. The emotional toll of the day's events, returning to school, basketball practice, the interview, finally caught up with Jamal as he sank into the couch beside his father. You did well today, Reginald said quietly. Better than well. I'm proud of you. Jamal nodded, fatigue evident in the slump of his shoulders. Do you think it will make a difference? All of this. Reginald considered the question with the thoughtfulness it deserved. Yes, he answered finally, not as much as it should perhaps, not as quickly as we'd hope. Systems resist change, especially when that change threatens established power. But what happened to you and our response to it has created a moment where real reform is possible. He gestured toward the window, beyond which they could see the lights of the city stretching into the distance. Out there right now, there are police officers thinking twice about how they interact with young men who look like you. There are department heads reviewing their policies. There are lawmakers considering legislation. And most importantly, there are young people who see that standing up and speaking out can actually lead to consequences for those who abuse their power. Catherine joined them, sitting on Jamal's other side and taking his hand in hers. Change happens in moments like these, when something that's been invisible to many becomes impossible to ignore. Your voice helped make that happen. Jamal absorbed their words, finding comfort in the sense of purpose they offered. The bruise on his face would fade completely in time, but the impact of what had occurred would extend far beyond his personal experience. In the aftermath of trauma, he had found not just resilience but resolve, a determination to ensure that his story became part of a larger narrative of accountability and change. 3 weeks later, Jamal stood at the free-throw line in the final minutes of a tied game against their crosstown rivals. The gymnasium was packed, the crowd noise a constant roar as he bounced the ball twice, finding his rhythm. The bruise on his face had faded completely, though journalists still occasionally mentioned it in stories about the ongoing investigation and upcoming trial. Officers Harlan and Vickers had been fired officially the previous week, their termination letters citing violations of departmental policy and state law in language that left no room for ambiguity. The departmental review was proceeding with surprising transparency under Interim Chief Reynolds' leadership, with public hearings scheduled to begin the following month. Jamal was slated to testify along with several other young men who had come forward with similar experiences. As he prepared to shoot, Jamal caught sight of his father in the stands, Reginald having left work early to attend the game. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, a moment of connection that carried the weight of everything they had experienced together since that night. Taking a deep breath, Jamal released the ball with perfect form, watching as it arced toward the basket. The net snapped as the shot went through cleanly, putting his team ahead with seconds remaining on the clock. The crowd erupted. His teammates swarmed around him in celebration, and for that moment Jamal was simply a basketball player who had made a crucial shot. But as he glanced again toward his father, whose proud smile carried shades of both joy and lingering sorrow, Jamal understood that he had become something more as well. A young man who had experienced injustice and chosen to transform that experience into action. The path forward would not be easy, the work of reform not quickly accomplished. But he faced it now with a clarity of purpose forged in the crucible of that night's encounter. Justice, he had learned, was not simply served. It was fought for, demanded, and claimed through persistent effort and unwavering resolve. And in that ongoing struggle, he had found not just his voice, but his place in a movement larger than himself, a movement that would continue long after his own story had faded from the headlines. As the final buzzer sounded and his teammates lifted him onto their shoulders in victory, Jamal allowed himself to fully inhabit the moment, to be both the basketball player celebrating a win and the young man committed to ensuring that what had happened to him would lead to meaningful change. In that balanced identity, he found a way forward that honored both who he had been before that night and who he had become in its aftermath. Justice had been served, but the work continued, and Jamal Whittaker, his father's son in more ways than one, was ready to do his part.